All right, so here we are. This is your second to last unit that you'll have to endure for this class. You're almost there. This is Central and Eastern Africa to the 18th century. So again, this region going all the way up to what it was like prior to colonization. So you only have one more after this. Hang. All right, so the map over there to your right gives you an idea of the region that we're talking about. Starting off talking about the Congo River Basin. This is Africa's largest tropical rainforest. And so there's a lot of navigable rivers and clearings of savanna. It's not an unbroken area of dense vegetation, but this is the region, again, that we're talking about today. There's a varied environment in this region, and it allows for a variety of different productive activities. But basically, in this region, people were either farmers, fishers, hunters, or all three. The best known specialist hunters in this region were the very famous short-statured pygmies of the dense forest. But all required a more cooperative effort than elsewhere on the continent in order to make a go of any kind of civilization. So people of the Congo forest generally lived in villages of anywhere from 30, pretty small, to 200 adults. And so the less amount of people you had in your village, typically the village would be short on any kind of labor, no surprise there. But the more people you had, the more you had to press in on those natural resources, and the more likelihood that there could be some sort of exhaustion of the local environment. Typically, all the adults in the village were in some way related, and so because of this, there was usually some sort of exchange from brides from one village to another, and this was the basis of relationships amongst the villages, is this extension of kinship. Women were the main cultivators, so they are the ones who were responsible for growing the crops. And in this region, at least, they were subservient to men. And captives and hostages, who were essentially slaves, also performed these agricultural tasks. So the main kingdom in this region that we'll be focusing on, though we'll be talking about a few others, is going to be the Kingdom of Congo. In the 1480s, we've talked about this many times, the Portuguese are going to arrive off the coast of West Central Africa near the mouth of the Congo River, and because of this, they're going to come in contact with the Kingdom of Congo and establish diplomatic relations with them. And so the King of Congo hoped to benefit from this. He hoped that the Portuguese would supply teachers and craftsmen to his kingdom to help educate and train them. And also provide them with new weapons that they could use to expand. The Portuguese, in exchange, wanted a profitable trade in gold, silver, copper, and spices. And they were disappointed that Congo could produce so little of these items that they wanted to gain money from through their trade with other nations. So in 1506, a Congolese Christian convert by the name of Afonso I is going to seize the throne. And he, being a Christian convert, had some close relations with the Portuguese king and the Pope as well. And he helped to develop Christianity in the Kingdom of Congo, but more along the lines of a royal religious cult. So blending Christianity with more native religious practices. But this also helped increase the authority of the king and undermine regional religious leaders. And so because of that, it rid the need for local support and made him heavily reliant on the Portuguese in order to maintain his authority. He also used Portuguese mercenaries. A mercenary is basically like a soldier for hire. They're people who don't necessarily fight for one nation. They hire themselves out. So they were used in the Kingdom of Congo as well, and guns to expand. And this expansion produced captives that they could then, in exchange, sell to the Portuguese. But in 1568 to 1569, Congo was invaded, and in 1574, a king by the name of Alvaro I is going to be reinstated by the Portuguese as pretty much like a puppet king. So they're able to reinstate them. He has to do what they say. And because of this, the king's authority declines. They become more and more reliant on the slave trade. And remember from the previous unit, we talked about how it's not a good idea to put all your eggs in one basket. And so by the 17th century, the central authority collapses and Congo breaks up into several kingdoms. All right, so going on to talk about Angola. So if you remember from back when we talked about the unit on the transatlantic slave trade, Unit 12, they mentioned that typically different regions, the amount of slaves that they provided for the transatlantic slave kind of ebbed and flowed, except for Angola. They were pretty much throughout all time supplying quite a bit of slaves to the transatlantic slave trade. So in the 1530s, so early on in the transatlantic slave trade, Sao Tome became the major transit point for captives. And remember, that's an island off the western coast of Africa. Take a look at the map over there on the right to kind of refresh your memory. Eventually, Sao Tome slavers started evading royal control and purchasing slaves directly from Angola. Why would they want to do this? So that they don't have to pay taxes. I mean, it's the same way why people would want to engage in any kind of black market trading nowadays. You don't want to pay taxes on it and you want to maximize your profits. So that's what they're trying to do. The defeat of Congo made the Portuguese, therefore, want more direct control of the region because, again, they don't want a bunch of people trying to evade their control over the slave trade. And so if they can directly conquer a region, which we know eventually is going to happen to pretty much all of the continent, then they can control all trade in that region. Also, there's rumors of silver deposits in the region of Angola, and so they decide to go in and try to conquer it outright. So the Portuguese invasion of Angola is not great. They are defeated by local resistance and also tropical diseases. And if you do eventually take a class on European colonization, they'll talk about how one of the reasons why it was successful is the development of some treatment for tropical diseases. But that's beyond the scope of this class, so we won't get into that. However, the endemic warfare of the region, stimulated by the Portuguese invasion, is going to increase the supply of slaves to the coast. And so because of this, again, we mentioned it before, the Angola interior is going to become a major source of slaves from the 17th to 18th century. So to give you an example, by the mid-18th century, they are exporting about 10,000 slaves per year, just from Angola alone. So the Portuguese, at this point at least, learn their lesson and don't attempt to conquer the interior anymore. However, they don't really need to because the incessant wars in this region gave them all the slaves they needed. But the Portuguese attempts to tax the slave trade just encourages coastal dealers to sell to other Europeans, especially the Dutch, French, and English, who are also eventually going to establish colonies in the New World and have their own demands for slaves as well. All right, so moving to the east and slightly to the south of Congo, we have the Lunda Empire. It reaches its height in the first half of the 17th century, and partially because of their adoption of American crops that tend to do very well in this region. So maize and cassava are going to contribute to their growth. Cassava are going to contribute to the growth of this region. Their power was built on the collection and redistribution of tribute from outlying villages, and this helped stimulate the development of long-distance trade. So a small force of Lunda was eventually sent to gain control of the copper-producing region of the modern Zambian Congo copper belt. And the second half of the 18th century, they are going to develop into an independent kingdom. And the wealth that they're able to gain from these natural resources and their control of a well-organized long-distance trading network is going to benefit them as well. So by 1800, their capital is the center of a vast transatlantic trading network. And if you go back and you look at the map again, they're really in the center of the continent. And because of this, they could make use of both the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean trading systems. And they are exporting copper, iron, ivory, and of course, slaves. All right, so the chiefdoms of the modern nation of southern Malawi are going to organize under 3 ruling dynasties in this region as well. So we're moving now more towards the eastern coast of the continent. So the opposite side of the continent, as we talked about in the last unit, and to the south of it as well. And so this originally was a federation of chiefdoms, and their most important export is going to be iron, which of course also has to be manufactured in this region as well. They also participated in the ivory trade with the Portuguese, although there was a gradual decline after 1650 because there was no real effective central administration. And this left the way open for violent slaving caravans and raids to come into this region to try to capture slaves to be sold into the slave trade. Wow. All right. So the violence and the oppression of the Portuguese in this region also provoked widespread resistance from local peasant population who saw what was happening and did not want to see themselves as, under the thumb of the Portuguese as well. And so they started to develop, it prompts the development of private armies in this region. And because of the Portuguese coming in and creating this widespread resistance, the poor sought the protection of the rich. It's not too dissimilar from what happened in the quote-unquote Dark Ages, although that's not really a good term for the Middle Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire, in which there was so much invading from different tribes that the poor sought the protection of the rich. And in some regions of Europe, this eventually led into the manor system. So it's kind of similar here. So the poor are going to the rich in order for protection from these raids. So those who own large herds of cattle are going to attract dependents, and they are going to provide them with military service. So again, very similar to the manor system. And so young men from poor families will serve in these independent armies of these wealthy individuals in exchange for enough cattle to pay for the bride price for the establishment of their own families. Eventually, one such wealthy cattle owner is going to acquire a pretty significant private army, and he's going to take the title of Changamair. His highly disciplined and well-trained army becomes known as the Destroyers. And from 1684 to 1696, they are able to expel the Portuguese from their local trading fairs and become the dominant power of this region. This power was based on the very strict discipline of their army and the fact that they kept control of the mining of gold. And they prevented the Portuguese from getting access to their gold mines. And so as a result, no Portuguese were allowed in this empire at the time. Some other regions, so the East African interior, other regions, there's not a whole lot of knowledge known at this time because we don't have a lot of contemporary written sources. But we are going to talk about a few regions that we do know about, but again, what we know is limited because we don't have written sources. All right, so the Bunyoro were a loose confederation of village-based chiefdoms under the overall authority of a king, so kind of similar to how we have our states. Our states in the United States have some independence, but are under the overall authority of the federal government. Similar kind of concept here. They had a mixed economy of farming, hunting, and herding. Their chiefdoms provided military regiments for raiding on neighboring civilizations in which they would seize cattle to be used in their own civilization. So the raids from the Bunyoro may have been the contributing factor for the clans of Buganda to organize as well in response. But again, we don't really know because there's no written sources, so we're not exactly sure. They eventually are going to develop as a small, compact state under the intensive control of a centralized government. They had an economy based largely on agriculture, and their main crop was the banana, which, if you remember, this is going back a few units, but the banana was introduced from Southeast Asia to the African continent. But the banana plantations in this region provided a certain level of stability because, again, more agriculture leads to more stability. So a majority of the agricultural population were dominated by a minority of pastoralists. So recall in Chapter 8 that the increasing importance of cattle herding in this region before 1500 led to the rise of numerous small kingdoms because, again, more stable food source means more political organization, generally speaking. They had mixed farming. They farmed a couple of different things, but a few developed as specialist cattle keepers, including the Bahima in the north and the Batutsi in By the 18th century, the Tutsi of the south are going to merge into two kingdoms, Rwanda and Burundi. And Rwanda is going to emerge as the most powerful of the two. The Tutsi then develop rituals and the myth of ancient origin to help justify their dominion over a subservient population of people known as the Hutu. Now, originally, And somebody already did a presentation on Rwanda, so we know, in case you didn't already know, you know eventually there's going to be, in the 1990s, a genocide of the Tutsi. And we know that at that point, the Hutu and the Tutsi were ethnic groups, but there wasn't originally actually an ethnically based system. It was possible for a Hutu to pass into the ranks of a Tutsi elite, so it was more of a class system. But eventually the class distinction is going to consolidate into a ethnically based system. But that again happens over the course of time. This wasn't originally how it was. So the dominant development in this region is going to be the expansion of the Maasai. This is going to be part of the final movement of those Nilotic-speaking pastoralists who were pushing south into the 16th and 17th century. They were pushed through the Rift Valley towards the what is today the northern part of Tanzania. The grasslands were occupied and they had to seize them by force. And they justified their actions by claiming that all cattle in the region belonged to the Maasai. Their society was organized into an age-set system along military lines. Children, young adults, and elders. In their early teens, boys had to pass through an initiation, which required military training. And they served as young adults, as full-time soldiers and herdsmen in their civilization. So there you go. That is, again, our second to last unit. If you're wondering what we're going to end up with, it's going to be Southern Africa to the 18th century. Remember, this class goes by time period and region. And so we've got one more after this. That's next week. And that'll wrap it up. So again, you're almost there. Hang in there. Almost done.